So we have a really excellent panel here today, as you'll find out once we get into the conversation. And I want to start by setting the stage a little bit on why smart cities matters. And I'm segueing a little bit off of what Dr. Masood Amin talked about yesterday during his presentation at 4:30. 100 years ago, only 2 out of every 10 people lived in an urban area. That rate has slowly climbed to where we are today, which is about 50% of human population lives in cities. But that's not stopping. That rate of trajectory is continuing. And so by the year 2030, 6 out of every 10 people will live in an urban area. And by 2050, 7 out of 10 people will. And we all know that population growth is growing tremendously. And so I'd like to ask Becky Harrison to lead off with this answer.
Sure. Well, smart cities really is about integrating and leveraging technology to provide better services to the citizens there. And I think it started out as just doing e-business as cities, and it's continuing to evolve and grow. And in the future, I think the integration of critical services and the systems that they have to share data will be critically important in making those cities smart. A good example of that comes from looking at restoring service in a very large scale event. So we did a report last year about improving electric grid resiliency and reliability looking at it from the lenses of Superstorm Sandy and what happened there. And we based that on a workshop we had where we had about 20 utilities and several of our vendor members participate in a workshop to discuss what grid modernization had done in restoring service during Sandy, what it could have done, and what it would never do. And in that conversation, some very interesting things came out as a result. And one of the things that came out is the value of being able to share information. So if you could imagine in a smart city, you have a very large-scale event, and when the utilities go to start trying to do damage assessment, if they had access to all the surveillance cameras that were in the city looking at their equipment and could sit in an office or maybe even through intelligent computing, be able to look at that data and determine damage assessment without having to send people out to walk the lines or ride the lines, that could do a lot to help them plan their restoration efforts much more quickly. The other interesting comment was that they were getting tweets from customers with GPS tagged photos and everything else showing them damage. And again, it's how do you take that data and make it useful? So when I think about smart communities, it's really about integrating data from various sources and making it actionable to provide faster and better services to the citizens of that community.
I agree with that. I like the thought of people living in a city where the people responsible for the safety and security of the city are able to visualize or see everything that's going on in that city that protects citizens, keeps the lights on, keeps the city safe and secure, and so forth. But let's talk about energy. That's why we're here. How will smart cities evolve in the future to include energy? Not just what's possible today, but what's possible in the future, and what investments do we need to do today to make that future investment possible? And I'd like to offer that up to Stephen first.
Sure. I think energy and water are the lifeblood of all communities. And so when I think about a smart city, I can't imagine having a smart city unless you had a great handle on where your energy is being used. And what's interesting about energy and water is, I think someone had said it earlier, is energy is very water dependent and water is very energy dependent. And so they're interdependent upon one another and related. And so oftentimes to begin a smart city program, we must look at it from the standpoint of how are we using these vital resources and how are we making most of these resources for our citizens. And so when I think about a smart city and I think about energy and water, I really believe that that's where it all begins. And the great place about where we are today as a country, at least in the United States, is we spent an enormous amount of money upgrading the infrastructure, the energy and water infrastructure over the past several years through smart grid programs and AMI programs and the like. And so now the big challenge, I think, Becky, as you were saying, is how do we take this data and make it a vital part of the smart city program? The difference in energy and water is that data typically is there today, where 5 years ago it may not have been there. And so we have the data, and it's one thing that we're very focused on is taking that data, making it available not only to the utility, but to the citizens, to the city leaders, in a format that they can use it. And so I think energy and water are key. I actually think you really can't have a smart city unless you begin with the most precious resources that your citizens use every day.
Absolutely. I forgot, let me back up and just let the audience know that 3 of our panelists have to leave right on the dot at 4 o'clock. So if they slip away during Q&A, it's not because they don't like you. They have to, they're trying to make a flight tonight, and they're on the end over there. And then let me back up also and offer the definition of a smart city to anyone else on the panel. Becky already shared with us that has a lot to do with data and visualization. Do others on the panel have a different way they want to answer that question? Or?
I think one thing that's interesting, and I heard Bill earlier today talk about 3 letters that are all the same and that kind of thing. So if we want to keep that theme going, I think the Smart Grid Smart Cities Readiness Council defined it as communities that are effective at collecting data, communicating data, and then crunching data.
The 3 C's,
and I think that's really a convenient way for me to look at it, is that smart cities do exactly that with energy and water type infrastructure, but they leverage that communications link as a way to both bring that data back, but also communicate information about the performance of those networks effectively to their communities. So there's a lot of C's associated with the smart cities idea.
Very true. Joel, did you want to offer up?
We're in an age where the word smart gets added to everything. Everything is becoming smart. When we're talking about vehicles, we're talking about smart charging of vehicles. So everything is going to be generating information. And that's really the challenge that we're going to have with the whole concept of smart cities. We're going to see an overwhelming amount of data start coming in. The vehicle is just going to be one of many appliances in the home that will be connecting and communicating. The density of our populations in San Diego, with over 50% of our population in multi-unit dwellings, the prediction is that future housing in San Diego will be 85% of new construction will be multi-unit dwellings. Wow. And within these compact, more dense living environments, we will be generating an enormous amount of data. So one of the major challenges that we will have for smart cities is the ability to collect, analyze, and do appropriate planning with that data. So I see the IT aspect as being one where a lot of attention will need to be placed, and the appropriate levels of security in order to protect those that are generating the data as well.
Let's take a slightly different spin on this, though. It seems like we've talked a lot about data, but what do smart cities mean to people? How is a smarter city changing the quality of life for all of us in one? Does it go beyond data?
Well, I think it's the essence of a smart city is what does it do for the people of that city? Right. And so when you define a smart city, it is about data and information, all those things, but you can't define it without saying what's the end goal. And the end goal is we want to be more sustainable in how we live our lives. We want to create cities that that are very livable and enjoyable for its citizens. And then workability is a big issue. You want to live in a city where it's a great place to go to work. And so the goals of the smart city is really creating that environment that enhance those 3 activities from my perspective.
Workable,
livable, and sustainable.
And sustainable.
Probably cost effective.
And cost effective.
I think if you can't make the business case for it, then it's not worth doing.
It
won't get funded.
One of the big benefits of smarter cities that I think about is safety, people being out and about, and law enforcement agencies seeing where hotspots are for crime, able to to create policing forces to address those areas, helping people be able to walk around wherever they want to go, whenever they want to go there, and not worry about it, and just having a whole level of visualization. Not that everything's on camera all the time, but just a better understanding of where people are, where safety is, and how to bring those two and connect them. And Marty, do you have any thoughts on any of this? No, I'm sorry, not Marty, Jeff, I apologize.
Okay. No, I think as you look at smart cities, I think London and Washington, D.C. are two examples where specifically safety, is integrated, so.
Yep, and cities have to be sustainable, walkable, safe, secure, and workable. To me, a smart city is a really fun place to be. It's where all the services are available without needing a car, where you can have a variety of incomes and still take advantage of everything that a city has to offer. It's a little bit utopia.
So I think it's taking that information and making life better. So in a very dense city, in a very densely populated city, you think about it, you have a car wreck, it takes out an electric pole. How does all that information work together so that the power's rerouted, the traffic is rerouted, and they can get the vehicles to the location both to service the accident vehicle and the people involved, but also get the lights back on as quickly as possible and fix the situation. So those are the kinds of things that integrated data can help in making a difference in people's lives. And I think as we get denser populations, as we get more dependent on our digital economy that runs on electricity, all those things have to work together in a positive manner so that when things happen, they can be fixed very quickly and their impacts can be minimized. And I think that's part of what a smart city does.
Absolutely. Okay, just moving on to the next topic. Let's talk about policies, because there are some policies in place that are barriers to a smarter city and some that are helpful. And so what policies and practices are needed to support the smart city, the utopia that we'd like to see? And I'll offer that one up to Becky to start.
Well, I think certainly the ability to share data and have interoperability of that data. So if you're looking at this, and it's much like the discussion that was earlier about silos and utilities and their business making decisions, but you think about different aspects of government or utilities or other providers that need to be able to share data. And if you're looking at it from your silo, you're not going to see the value of interoperability or standard terminology or things that make that integration happen easier. So I think one of the things that policy does is help look out after public good and set up kind of the rules of the road to help make that interaction possible by helping to define what those interoperability points have to be. And it's not just the technology, it's probably the business processes, it's probably the terminology, it's how you fit it all together.
Who else would like to discuss their view of that? Anyone else want to chime in on policy?
Well, I'll say that you have to understand that from the beginning that there are many stakeholders in building a smart city. And much like the way economic development is done in states throughout our country today, when there's a big economic development project, you often pull resources from multiple sources to help with that economic development strategy. And I believe smart cities are the same way. Energy is managed from a regulatory perspective very different from water in most places. And so you have to get both of those stakeholders at the table at the very beginning of a process. How you share data and communicate data and where you have the police involved or safety, everybody has their own vested interest, and most cities can't afford to do everything at once. And so I think that there's information out there and resources out there. I know on the Smart Cities Council, a guide to how you get started. And for people to look at it from a big picture perspective as opposed to a siloed perspective is very important. It requires very strong leadership. And then prioritizing which one of those policies prohibit you from enacting a small demonstration project or a small example of what moves the city forward. It's important to overcome those hurdles early. And I think the only way you do it is if you have a lot of people involved and all the stakeholders at the table when developing a strategy for a smart city.
And I think it's going to be more likely an evolutionary revolution as opposed to a snap your fingers and all of a sudden City X is smart. And I think that's going to require a business case that gets developed. And it's going to include social issues and economic issues both to get there. So I don't think you'll likely see that quick turn the light bulb on and there all of a sudden we've declared we have a smart city.
True, that's a good point. One of the things that that I've read about and I like to think about are some of the frustrations of living in a city. For example, include parking. It's really challenging to find a parking space, and studies show that 30% of traffic congestion in a city is related to people driving around looking for a space. And a smart city offers the opportunity to have digital sensors on parking spaces that will reflect when a space is open. And then your app would tell you where they are, and you would just go drive to them and park there. I think that's really neat. Another benefit of a smarter city is synchronized lighting, synchronized traffic lights, lights that turn green when there's traffic one way and no traffic is the other way. So the light is green for you, you never have to stop. Or when there's traffic both ways, it clears the traffic one way and then turns. And I live in Atlanta. It admittedly is a big city, and there are very few synchronized lights. What a waste of gas. What a level of frustration for drivers there. And of course, there's certainly no way to know where a parking space is open. So when I think about a smart city, I think about ways to make my life easier as an urban dweller. Are there other ideas that you know about or thoughts that you've had or read about that makes a smarter city on a human personal level, that makes it a better place to live? Anybody? Throw out anything? No?
Well, we've already seen improvements with public transportation where now when you're standing at a bus stop, there are applications that will actually tell you where that bus is, when it's going to arrive, so that people can plan their time a little more accurately. I think those types of innovations are going to continue to evolve. One of the concerns that we've bumped into with the electrification of transportation is how do we make these new technologies available to all so it doesn't become stratified? Only the people that can afford technology get the benefit of these advancements. And I know that's a concern in the state of California right now with the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program. There's a concern that subsidies need to be distributed evenly within the community and not just to the people that can afford the technology at this time. And that's a really big challenge. And so the only way, and you had cited cost effectiveness, that goes across the board until we can bring these technologies down to a level where the average individual or even people that may be below the mean can afford these technologies, it's not a democratic rollout. And so we need to pay attention to that in the process of developing smart cities.
Well, and I'll tag on to that because one of the neat things I think that Washington has is they've got vehicles that you can go reserve and go jump in and take off. I can't remember what they're
Zip
called.
cars.
Well, they're right here.
So anyway, if you think about it from more low income, if you had a subscription service that you might give them access to those green jump in the car and go vehicles, that might be one way to help levelize the playing field. So I think there are lots of ways. But another thing that I think is interesting about smart cities, and I like to look at Chattanooga as an example, they have put in broadband in their city, and they put in their smart meters on top of the broadband and their automation of their grid. Now, of course, they're a muni, so they own all the services, which I think makes it hugely advantageous to try and pull it off all at once. But they have made that a high-tech city that is now, and they've built it to attract businesses to come in. So they now have this wonderful broadband capability, high-speed internet, and they're using it to attract businesses and young college graduates to move into the community and live there and work there. And I participated in another panel earlier this year that was talking about smart infrastructure. And one of the things that they predicted is that in the future, where our generation moved to where the job is, The next generation may very well be defining, I'm going to live in this city, and the jobs are going to have to come to them in order for it to have that employment base. So if you think about smart cities in terms of economic development and what they can mean, that smart cities can drive the type of companies that then locate there and the type of workforce they have, which can raise the economic value to the whole community.
Very good point. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about what role energy plays, since we are on a Smart Cities panel and we are at an Energy Thought Summit. We've heard a lot about the next generation of energy, distributed generation, being a big part of the conversation these past 2 days. We've heard about policies that need to change. But let's talk about energy for these big, heavily populated mega cities. How are we going to get enough energy to power them sustainably? What needs to happen so that, and I love the idea of chilled water. Which utility? Austin Energy is doing chilled water. A lot of their condo units downtown, I learned on the last panel, have, I don't know what they're called. They're not called boilers, are they, when they're chilled water?
Chillers.
Chillers. Thank you. They have
It's
chillers.
a high-tech term.
It's very cool. So anyway, literally, pun intended. So let's talk about what that means a little bit more. We've touched on it, but maybe, Jeff, you could share with us your thoughts on emerging technologies. That's your field at Leidos,
Sure.
right? What's coming for energy in terms of cities?
Well, for sure it's a driver for economic development, it's a driver for energy security, and it's a driver for the environment. I think that as you look at examples, you look what Austin's done around job creation with their clean tech consortium here. You look at some tactical examples like what Gainesville, Florida has done and what Sacramento have done around DG Solar, around job creation.
Let me stop you there. What have they done? Maybe many of us aren't familiar with that, but keep your thought. I want to hear that too.
Sure. Both have incorporated significant amount of solar local to the city. We all are well aware that there are transportation losses. So they're able to augment and sort of band-aid those rising energy prices there in the city locally.
Gainesville's done that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And so I think when you look at, as the cities look at, DOE tells us we have 80 billion to 130 billion in economic losses a year due to power outages. So I think that's a real differentiator for a city that has a resilient grid when they look at trying to market and retain this type of talent. And then when you look at those that are on top of that resilient grid, a good example, San Diego, Austin, that have made these underlying infrastructure investments, you know, the ability to incorporate DG and sort of stabilize the prices in that given geography.
That's a good idea. I like that.
If I could add something about water, you know, about 35%, it's an amazing statistic, of water is lost, filtered water is lost. That's an international statistic. And so if you think about that, I know where I live in Jackson, Mississippi, the infrastructure is very old, the water infrastructure, and there's just an enormous amount of water that's being lost as it's traveling through the system and reaching consumers. And that in itself is a huge amount of waste. And so it's really not expensive, that expensive relatively, to put sensors on all of those water places to be able to detect where leakage, that technology is available, where leaks occur, or you have a line that's not operating properly. And so that small investment of sensors on your water distribution system is a critical investment to make before you go spend millions and millions of dollars of building new capacity to produce water.
And that's
Plus all the electricity that's spent
that's right.
pumping and treating water that's never used.
That's never used.
And so, you know, there's a double benefit. And I think that's the key to the smart city thing is the integration of multiple infrastructure systems and seeing a benefit in water that also benefits electricity. And that's, I think, how you're going to support these larger and larger cities is by being more efficient with each individual utility, but also with the synergy between them, like you talked about with energy and water and gas and others.
I think that's the long pole in the tent getting out of the gate. I know both Stephen and Marty have expertise in telecom. And I think as you have looked at the initial smart grid deployment and what the smart cities and communities following behind or in conjunction with, I think that communications infrastructure is the single most important decision a community or city can make to take advantage of those wireless sensors or whatnot.
No, and Chattanooga is an excellent example of that. Their baseline foundational layer was that broadband network.
So,
So
go ahead.
in San Diego, you wonder where to start with these programs. In San Diego, we have formed a coalition. It's actually called Smart City San Diego. And it's formed with San Diego Gas and Electric, General Electric, University of California, San Diego, and also our Clean Tech Coalition in San Diego. And the concept is that each of these players brings to the table particular networks and expertise. And the focal point for these have been, in fact, the way the group is described is that it's to improve the region's energy independence, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and assert San Diego as a clean energy leader. Two of the projects that they've done so far, one was looking at we have one of our main attractions, the San Diego Zoo, acres and acres of parking lot. Tracking solar collectors were installed in this parking lot. Plug-in electric vehicle charging was installed below those charging canopies, and a battery backup system in order to collect some of the solar generation during the day for that utilization for charging was also incorporated. The integration of the all-electric car share program, you see Car2Go out here. We have Car2Go, but we have the only all-electric car fleet in the United States for that program. Integrating that with our public infrastructure program, and this is how it grows. It has to be an effort that brings in all aspects of the community. Without the direct participation of the city of San Diego and the decision makers in San Diego, this would be an impossibility. Just getting those electric vehicles on the streets required a number of variances and waivers, et cetera. It took over a year to get that program so it could be implemented. And these are the types of challenges that we're going to, dealing with the practical aspects and the minutia that goes along with the implementation of these technologies as well. That just gives you an example of where we might start and how it might grow.
I think what San Diego has done is really impressive. And let me move on to my last question. So I want to make sure that the audience has lots of time to ask questions of, especially the panelists that have to leave right on the dot at 4. So if you all want to start lining up. But the next question is, so I am not that well traveled in Asia and Latin America. I've never been to Asia at all. I've only been to Mexico and Latin America. I have been to Europe plenty, and I've been to like the Caribbean and Aruba and those places my husband likes to relax and go to sunny spots. I like to go to culturally diverse places, and so he's won most of those battles. But what's weird to me, and I mention that only because what's weird to me is that there are 10 cities in Asia that I've never heard of that have a population bigger than 10 million people. Our biggest city in the US is New York, right about 15 million people. But there are dozens of cities bigger than New York I've never even heard of in Latin America and Asia. I don't know the names of them, and yet they exist and they're growing by leaps and bounds. So what I'd like to ask the panel now is, what cities are in the lead for smart cities, for integrating these technologies, these devices, this data? I'd like to hear your answer in two ways. One, what cities in the US? We've already talked a little bit about San Diego and Chattanooga and a little bit about Gainesville. What others? And then what cities globally are in the lead in terms of what you know? Many of you are much more well-traveled than I am, but you don't have to have traveled to know the answers. Who's doing it right? Jeff?
Well, I think one of the cities I'd look to is my adopted home of Charlotte. I'd look at the Envision Charlotte, where they've harnessed 70 commercial buildings downtown and are sharing that information and building that community awareness and cost. So I'd look at what Charlotte has done. I think as you look abroad and look at Hong Kong, the integrated grid that they have there.
What has Hong Kong done?
A completely integrated,
integrated
modernization with sensing communications. Yeah, I would look at, you know, of course, Dubai comes to mind. They might get dinged a little bit on the water aspect, you know, when you look at how water is used there. But I think those are two leaders. I think that there are certain cities that have aspects, you know, Amsterdam, Vienna, I mentioned London earlier. You know, again, we talk about smart cities, smart communities. It's a process maybe more so than a, you know, destination, right? It's just a way of measuring it, what aspect and where they stand at any given point in time, so.
Okay, thank you.
One interesting city, and I misplaced the name of it, in South Korea, actually has a smart rubbish system where they've installed pneumatic tubing, piping throughout their city to sort, select, and recycle trash.
I love it.
You know, very difficult to do in an established older city in the U.S., but it's a newly developed city in Korea, and it's doing smart refuse, basically. And it's taking advantage and eliminating truck rolls for garbage collection, which helps on your congested city type concept. So there's other infrastructure systems out there other than what we might. I haven't thought about
smart trash.
Yeah, well, you know, we think typically, at least in our realm of energy, water,
I got 3 teenagers, Marty. I would love smart trash.
Just suck it right out of the house. Yeah, it's like that garbage chute in your condo, only kicked up a few notches. So.
Well, I also think Detroit, believe it or not, is embracing the investments they've made in infrastructure, particularly related to electric and gas infrastructure, and they're integrating that data with information related to parking challenges, with the information that city leaders need to be able to make important decisions, traffic lighting sensors. There's a project ongoing that I believe is going to commence in the fall, where they'll start rolling out in Detroit a smart city data. We're involved with that project. It's interesting. Mobile applications, the smartphone is being used to deliver that data to all the necessary participants. And I know you made a good point relative to the economic status of your citizens. There's no way to reach everyone, but I think using mobility to reach citizens is a pretty good bet today, that if you can deliver all that data via mobile applications, that you're at least off to a good start. So, you know, with all the troubles that Detroit has had, they are being very visionary and taking some serious initiatives around building a smarter city in Detroit.
And maybe the Phoenix will rise and become one of the more advanced cities in
well,
the
instead
US.
of the Caribbean, you might want to visit Detroit
I don't know about that.
your next vacation.
Joel, one thing I wanted to mention, you talked about income inequality. Stephen makes a good point. You know, when I talked about the sensors for parking spots, anybody can have an app on their phone that's free or 99 cents. And a lot of the things that benefit smart cities benefit everyone, like a safe place to walk, like light synchronization, things like that. So I'm hoping that smarter cities mean a more equitable city too. So
we do too. We have an experiment that's going on right now with our workplace charging for plug-in electric vehicles, and that's a program that is an app-driven program again. Where people can go in and establish a profile of what they find acceptable for pricing for charging their vehicle. When they get to work, they can pull into parking space, program which parking space they're in. Their profile gets pulled up. If the dynamic pricing, we're doing an experiment right now with dynamic pricing for this, if the pricing is within the parameters that they've preset, the vehicle begins to charge. If it isn't, it may be delayed until that pricing is reached later in the day, or if it's earlier in the day. So we're just beginning to feel our way through some of these interactions and some of the more real-time applications that we're going to be seeing, both with energy access and utilization, as well as pricing. So these are all going to be components of what we see as the smart city going forward.
Very good. All right, yes, sir, we have a question for the panel.
Hi, I'm Bill Meehan. This isn't really a question, but I was wondering if anybody has heard of a city called Masdar. It's in Abu Dhabi. It's actually, the website is masdarcity.ae, and it is a zero carbon, no water use. I mean, water is all recycled. It's a fascinating website to look at. I was fortunate enough to go visit them during construction. So they've really rethought the whole kind of utopia of what a smart city is. So if anybody has a chance, just check out masdarcity.ae, and it's really the utopia. Now, of course, they built it from scratch.
Yeah, that's the key.
So that's
right?
a whole different thing. But I think we can learn a lot from that city.
Has anyone heard of that city on the panel?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Has anyone been?
Not been.
No?
I think it's an interesting thought, though. If you look at China, who is building cities from scratch, they've got the opportunity to build smart cities from scratch. So I think in developing areas where you're getting really new urban centers, hopefully it will all be smart. So.
Yeah, okay. Well, do we have another question? All right, I was going to ask the panel, but you go ahead and then I'll ask mine.
Well, James Stockton, I think I meant to ask this during the smart home panel, but I didn't get a chance, so I guess just take it to a larger scale with the city. As all these services and as all these interactions are kind of coming about, who is going to own that interaction and those customer-facing, I don't know, apps or things? Because you've got companies like Comcast and different companies that may be in cable space or something like that, starting to get into home security, and that kind of breeds automation, and and it can grow from there. So I mean, I don't know where you guys kind of see that going, and then obviously take that to the bigger scale. As the city, obviously there are some things like if you get smart trash, that's kind of a taken care of on a different level. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
That's an excellent point, and something we've been working through with the vehicle electrification. Everyone is trying to position themselves as the intermediate that has access to and can either sell access or do reporting for the data that's being generated from all of these vehicles. It's kind of interesting, the automakers approached the utilities and they said, well, these are our customers. And we had to remind them that all of those customers had been using electricity long before they were thinking about buying a plug-in electric vehicle. It's a shared customer base. And we have very defined limitations on what we can do with data and how it can be handled. But we're seeing a lot of people are trying to move into this intermediate position of being the focal point for the data collection and how it'll be utilized. And it's something that we all need to pay close attention to going forward, so it's an excellent point.
Yeah, it's a tough, it's a great question that doesn't really have a very clean answer, to be honest. I'm seeing several business models come forth. One is where the city actually would own it and produce the integrated information and deliver it. The biggest challenge there is the utility. The city doesn't own the utility, and a lot of the data relative to smart cities is coming out of utilities, and how you get that data back into a city-owned application and that someone would pay for, and it's very complicated. I think the best thing to focus on at this moment in time is we live in a free market, and ultimately the best technology or the most innovative delivery model will win out. And so what we've tried to do is to encourage our customers that don't get hung up on, at this stage, don't get hung up on, who has to be that app deliverer. Let's just have a lot of apps, and then the delivery model will work itself out over time in a free market. So.
Well, and I would say technology is enabling the owner of the data to keep owning the data, and it's a service to get access to that data. So I think we'll come up with innovative models. The cloud is wonderful, and we all take advantage of data in the cloud. So I think it's how you aggregate it and how you bundle it together, and ultimately it may not be a big charge. It may be that little 99-cent app that you pay your part of, and it helps cover the overall cost. But the thing that I think smart cities and this whole gamut of discussion about how you bring it all together, most of this is public services and public goods. So however it gets paid for, we're ultimately all going to pay for it, but what you want it to be is as efficient and effective as possible.
I mean, I think optimization has to be a part of the equation. I mean, we've got a finite amount of resources, city, underlying energy provider, their customers, and that communication between, and you're trying to get that energy handshake, you know, that syncing of those resources. But I look at, you know, what Joel's facing, you know, out in California. You know, what happens when one aspect of that equation de-optimizes the entire ecosystem or food chain, if you will. So, to Stephen's point, you're probably going to see both evolve in the short term in the market.
Thank you.
I think Rio de Janeiro is another city that I don't think we mentioned, but has a very smart system, and particularly investing ahead of the Olympics and some of the other things that are taking place in Rio. They spend a lot of time on security and traffic monitoring and traffic congestion, and I don't know how much they tied energy into that smart city system in Rio, but I know it's gotten a lot of notoriety, and you can read about that on the web as well.
That'll be interesting to watch Rio as the Olympics approaches.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They certainly have traffic congestion.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you guys look at not only the new business models for utilities on the water, energy, and other sectors, but as well kind of the governance structure and this tug of war over control, right? Who controls what in the new cities? And perhaps now we're moving into a world in which people expect things, but we might not be willing to pay for them, right? And so you might have this generation that comes to a city and they want to have these services and things kind of provided, right, and available. But then we look at, well, how's that going to get paid for, and how are we going to get to that world in which we enable technology to serve you better? So I'm just curious what you guys think.
Well, I think it's a services model. So I think part of what we've got to do is get really smart about how you have that base level of service, and then you can get all the add-ons. And I go back and I look at my cell phone bill. I mean, I make choices about how much I'm going to pay for my cell phone service by what capabilities I want. And I could go back to a very basic phone and not have web access and not have all the smart apps on it. So I think it's a value proposition that we've got to figure out how to price it in a way that the end public feels like they have as much control over the choices they make, and they pay for what they're interested in.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is with some of this critical human infrastructure like water, there's only one style of water. You can't go to the store and pick 15 different flip phones versus smartphones over water. And some of that basic infrastructure, a lot of people don't value it in the same model that services like Telecom is valued. And so one of the bigger challenges with water is the low price of water, but the high cost due to leakage and other challenges. So I think it's going to be, it's hard to deliver energy and water in a lot of different flavors, much like it's certainly easier to deliver Telecom in a variety of flavors.
Well, I would probably argue with that a little bit in the sense that, think of it this way, it's a basic service. So if we could control the flow of how much of that commodity you get, you pay your base charge for the infrastructure and you get a certain amount, then the variety may be, okay, do I water my yard? Do I have access to this? So I think we've got to think differently even about how we think about some of these commodities and say, it is a usage issue and it's a time of day issue, and how do you differentiate the services based on those aspects and then charge differently?
And I think electricity is certainly moving in that direction. I think water has struggled with that differentiation to say, well, does water cost more at 5 in the afternoon than it does at 5 in the morning? And, but I think energy has definitely moved in that direction.
Looks like we have a question from our Master of Ceremonies.
Hi, guys. Thanks for being here. So I'm hoping that maybe you can take a leap of faith and help with the following thing. So clearly, when I think of a smart city, I'm thinking of digitalization of the city entirely. So it's not only power, it's not only telecom, it's not only water, it's not only gas, but it's transportation, it's education, it's healthcare. It's all kinds of things, right? And so the challenges the cities have is, where do I start, right? So could you all maybe give a prescriptive, what are the 3-4 things that the city must do? Because, you know, I think we're in many places already living the future, right? In Masdar and in Australia, I would argue utilities are bundling. I mean, the retailers are bundling all kinds of things. But what are the 3 or 4 things that they need to do to do this? I mean, it's so overwhelming, right? So where do they start?
I think Jeff should start with that one.
Oh, well, thank you, Patty. I will start with that.
Emerging technologies at Leidos.
I had the opportunity to support Austin Energy a couple summers ago as they developed the Texas River Cities Electric Vehicle Preparedness Plan. And, you know, very simply, at the city, at the community level, is that vision documented? Is that game plan documented? You got to have a game plan down, so I think you can drive towards policy.
How do they start with a game plan? I think that's Andres' question. Where do they really start if they're overwhelmed?
I mean, somebody has to go meet with the city leader and say, what's your vision for our city? I mean, if you want to talk about the fundamental place you start, a leader has to develop a vision for what you want to accomplish. And then he has to have the capability to pull together stakeholders that are important to the initial stage of a strategy and a vision for the city. And I also think it's important to not overthink it. Andreas, like you said, I think at the end of the day, the digitalization of everything is going to happen over time, but it's not all going to happen between now and next year. And so there are some, whatever the pain problems are at the city, whether it's traffic in Rio or parking in New York or whatever it might be, solving some of those initial 3 or 4 pain points, identifying those on the outset, I think are really critical to build momentum on your project. So, I mean, I think it starts with a vision, it starts with a strong leader, it starts with partners, or stakeholders, constituents. Like with Envision Charlotte, I know that, I mean, we're a participant in that project, but there's 10 or so, 11 corporate entities involved in that project. There's 70 buildings, is it right? 70 buildings that are involved. They've outlined a structure that is achievable with some small-term goals. They've created an easy way for consumers to access how they can participate and be a beneficiary and also contribute to the Smart City program. And so it's those little small steps that add up to, you know, eventual success over the long run.
I think a key part, so I think getting the community together and deciding what its priorities are by bringing a good stakeholder together.
Like
but I
having
also think it's timing it so that you are starting, make sure you phase it so you have benefits that you can highlight as you go along.
Sure.
So that coalition is going to be critical in order, and it's going to vary with cities. I mean, San Diego, we're at the end of transmission lines. We come to a dead end. We're a desert city. We received less than 50% of our hoped for rainfall this year. Those are the types of local priorities that are definitely going to influence, you know, where the energy and where the resources are put for any community. And it's critical if you don't have that kind of coalition building up front. I don't think you can set appropriate priorities for those communities.
Good points. Yes, sir, another question?
Maybe not a question, but sharing with you the interesting experience. Once I was Googling for tidal energy resources, and I came across interesting projects in Saudi Arabia. They building, American Europeans, they try to transform the cities from historical to smart cities. But Saudis, they build new cities. They build islands, artificial islands, on these artificial islands, they build the system, tidal system for energy conversion. They build cities, and they transport, of course, the electronics technology is saturated there. And the transportation, both through water or helicopter. So it's interesting how different thinking is between traditional culture, well, let's say Western culture, and those, oil connected.
Yeah, it's called oil.
But they,
There's a funding issue there.
those smart, but the investment is by those, the richest people who made a lot of dollars on oil, and they moving and building communities, smart communities, maybe not the cities, but smart communities. So it's the complex of buildings, the system, transportation, education, everything. So it's just a little tiny passage from the mainland to the island, and everything, the whole life is on this artificial island. I know I watched this video about this project, and the project is built with the support of German engineers, and they are already so advanced, and it's just, I was surprised how courageous thinking was about these people, but of course you have a lot of money to build this. But artificial island, an artificial island, tidal movement, using for energy, cleaning those salty water to provide buildings with water. So what do you need more? Energy, water, everything else, it's just there.
Thank you. Well, so I'll end with one more question to the panel, and if anyone else has a final question, come on up. So the gentleman just brought up water, and Stephen, you mentioned a lot of leaks that could be solved with more devices and sensors. There's a couple of things to say about water. One is, why haven't cities done a better job of finding leaks and saving all that money? Atlanta has a big problem as well. I know you mentioned Jackson does. Many cities do. And then electricity is a huge consumer of water. Some of the statistics include 30% of all water consumption, upwards of upper 40s, is used up by just generating electricity. So when we reduce electricity consumption, we reduce water consumption. And water is purported to be the next big crisis. We have a looming energy crisis, we have a looming climate change crisis, but water is supposed to be possibly even a bigger crisis because lots more people coming, lots more density in cities, and then not enough water, especially with drought and a lot of other causes, waste. How do you think smart cities can solve that problem? Why do you think they haven't done a better job of it as it is now? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think particularly in San Diego's case, desalination is a viable option to help solve that. It's a higher technology application. There's a lot of salt water in the world. Yeah. It's not usable in many
It's expensive.
cases. It is.
And that's the issue. A lot of these innovations are very expensive. So you have to wait until the priority gets to a level that it's worth that investment. We also have reclamation of used water. Unfortunately, that got labeled with the unfortunate moniker of toilet to tap very early. And there was a real resistance on the part of the population to utilize that water for drinking purposes. Yet we have semiconductor companies that prefer that water because the purity of that water is actually cleaner than what they can get for tap water. So there's a lot of misinformation that we have to, really work in the community to bring people up to the level so they can make responsible choices. That's a really unfortunate one. We use that water that's being reclaimed right now to water median strips along the highway, which is very unfortunate.
Anyone? We have a couple of questioners, but does anyone else have a burning anything? No? Okay. John?
I wanted to make an observation and ask a question. I promise I won't go on. When we talk about smart grid, we tend to equate that with utility modernization or grid modernization. When we talk about smart cities, we tend to look at municipal systems, municipalities, all the other infrastructures that they own, they operate and coordinate to deliver services. But when we talk about the edge, which is an au courant term, we're starting to talk about the users of the system and devices that are located and sensors that are located at the point of consumption. And now we're bringing in the consumers and the smart consumers of those services. I'm real intrigued with social networking and the opportunity to start edge collaboration that's sort of emergent. It's not dependent upon a large company like mine Siemens or Cisco or somebody like that cutting a deal with Barcelona that gets a lot of press because it's $500 million contract over 10 years or something like that. But rather it's simply innovation, edge activity that just pops up like mushrooms in the forest. Would you guys comment on the potential of people just to be empowered to just start doing things to make the city smarter?
I would, but again, information without the ability to act, without the infrastructure at the edge. When you look at what Duke Energy is doing from a decentralized architecture, pushing intelligence, analytics out to the edge, when you look at a field messaging bus at the edge.
Was it something I said?
Yeah, I think their cab is coming.
Okay.
I think everybody on the panel would agree with the social collaboration at the edge, but you have to have the ability to act. The underlying infrastructure has to be there.
Yeah, I think, John, that social media is going to just continue to be a more and more active part of the solution to creating smarter cities, smarter citizens, smarter everybody. There's somewhat of a generational thing, and where we work today, we always want to solve the problem right now, and some of the problems that we face are just going to take time. Yeah. And when I look at my children and the way they interact with social media, fortunately or unfortunately, I see a different generation. And I think when they get out into the working world and they start experiencing and paying for services that we take for granted or that we get today, and their perspective is going to be different. And so I actually think that, clearly there's a generational change that will take place when the young people of today get out into the working world because just what their expectations are and how they interact and use social media for everything today. So anyway, I think it will change over time.
Andres, do we have time for one more questioner? Okay, yes, sir, the last question.
Hi, I'm Tom Wortman with Concurrent Design. I'd like to touch on water again. You've talked on it a couple times. The idea of losing 35% of our processed water is pretty appalling. From an engineering, standpoint, that's appalling. Of course, that's a huge advantage over the electric guys who lose 2/3 of their production, right? So there's the good news. I had thought for some time that desalination would be part of the answer. We just mentioned that. But I've been reading stories about the salinity in the oceans, especially in the Arab Gulf, the Persian Gulf. It's getting so bad, it is killing off the oceans. And so I thought maybe that's not the answer. And so I thought about back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower developed the interstate highway system. So I submit for your consideration the interstate plumbing system. There are a lot of places in this country that have too much water, and a lot of places that don't have enough. It then becomes an engineering problem and perhaps reasonably manageable.
It's also an economic problem. The cost of pumping is another, like Joel was saying, with the cost of desalination, the cost of water transport, but it's a viable solution in some regards, I think. And the cost of distributing that water.
There's no technology involved in that solution. It's,
Yeah, I would.
It's work.
Well, right, it is. It's economics as well.
Well, it's also water has become a local problem. So, you know, when you look at it from an interstate perspective, most water is solved locally, not on a national basis. And so
there's not a water.
There's no,
ISO.
and I think that creates an issue.
The economic problem, turn that on its head and make it an economic opportunity. You know, I speak with my sister in New Jersey, and they've got lots of water. She would love to give us some. Well, she could sell it to us, and then the economic problem is perhaps self-resolved.
Could be.
Just a consideration.
I would also say let's consider that technology can't solve all of our sustainability problems, and we have to be smart about where we live and where we develop and where we let human population develop into areas where people don't belong. And then we try to solve those sustainability problems with technology that then is wildly expensive, and then subsidies are put in place that shouldn't be. And so let's think smart and be sustainable, and not assume technology is the solution for everything, because it's just not.
Great.
Okay, well, join me in thanking the panel today.